All right, so here's what's new with material groups as used with Fusion items in Modo 11.2. First, a look at how things worked prior to Modo 11.2 to give us a sense of the benefits of this new option. So here I have a very simple Fusion item consisting of a sphere and two boxes that we see here in the items list. And I have the Fusion item set to Airtight Final with Parts, which was the only mode we had in the past that supported the creation of parts and material groups that can be used for shading. I'd note that with a procedural item like a MeshFusion item, a lot of the things that you would associate with the assignment of parts or material groups are not available while that is a live model. For example, I couldn't use the material selection mode to select those parts. You won't see them listed in the lists, even though Fusion is creating them internally. The only place you will see them is in the shader tree. Here I've in advance set up some sort of placeholder materials, each assigned to the Fusion item, but not assigned to any particular part. And if we open one of those up, there's a material, hasn't really been assigned anything yet, but if we just go here to the texture layer and set the polygon tag type to part and look at our polygon tags, you see that we have several for each of our primitives, especially the sphere. And that's because the sphere is being cut up into 4 pieces by the planes. So there are these 4 parts, a part being the portion of the surface enclosed by a set of Fusion strips. So I could, for example, set this particular texture layer. I could assign it to this first part, sub D sphere 000, and do something with material so that we can tell. And that's fine as far as it goes, but if I wanted the whole sphere to have that material, I would have to set that material for each of those 4 parts. I'd have to set a material up for each of those 4 parts and make them identical, and it's a real inconvenient way to do things. And beyond that, if I were to move the sphere, those parts obviously change. There are 4 now, but if I move it over here, there's only 1. I move it back here, and then over here you see the part that is getting that material is dynamic. It's getting shifted as I play with the Fusion model. And most of the time you don't want that either. What would be preferable is to have a single material assigned based on the source mesh, not on each of these individual sections or segments or parts of the source mesh. And that's exactly what we will get if we go to the Fusion item and change the mesh mode to Airtight Final Item Parts. And you notice right away that the entire sphere now has that single material. And if we go back to the shader tree, we could actually go to each of these, select our part, and you'll notice there's now just 1 part for each of our source meshes. So we'll set that one to box A. And we'll set this one to box B. And there you have it. And of course that'll be persistent since there's now just 1 material for each source mesh. No matter how we change the model, obviously we still have knowledge of which surfaces belong to which source mesh. So you will notice, however, that the strip remains gray. It has its own part, its own, and therefore if you wanted to assign a material to it, it would have to have its own separate material. That's just sort of a limitation of what we can do with a live Fusion model. When outputting the Fusion mesh, Fusion does a little extra work and creates, in addition to these parts that end at the boundary of a strip, it creates material groups which each go to the center of the strip. So you get continuous shading all the way to the center of the strip. That capability was always there, but there were some problems with really complex models that would generate hundreds, if not thousands, of these individual parts. The script that concatenated those into more sensible source mesh-based material groups was excruciatingly slow. So this new Airtight Final Item Parts option does two things. It gives us a better look at materials with the live fusion model, and speeds things up when outputting the mesh and generating material groups. So again, no matter how I modify the model now, the materials remain persistent. You see a little flashing there. That's because the mesh momentarily became non-airtight. It must be airtight for any of these parts and materials options to work. All right, let's see what we get when we output the Fusion mesh. And first, a little tip. Because of the steps that Fusion goes through when converting the live Fusion mesh to a regular mesh, it can get confused about these material group assignments. So if you have materials that you've assigned to parts of the live Fusion model that you want to keep around, to avoid confusion when the new materials are created, I suggest going in and changing the item that they are assigned to anything other than the Fusion item. A sensible thing to do would be to assign them to the source meshes that they're associated with. That'll help you remember what you had in mind. So I'll set this one to sub-D sphere. I'll set this one to box A, and I'll set this one to box B. And if you don't have any materials assigned, or you don't care about the temporary materials you assign to the live mesh, you can just throw these out. It's just, you just don't want any of these material groups assigned to the Fusion item, because that will confuse the location, really is all, of the new materials when they show up when we output the mesh. All right, so back to items, Fusion item, and we're going to dupe and convert to mesh, and again we have it set to airtight final item parts. You want to make sure this create material groups box is checked. It's checked by default. Just make sure that it still is, and then hit create mesh. Everything turns white. That's the default shader. And if we go to the shader tree, we see we now have material groups for each of the named after each of the original source meshes. And same thing. We could go about assigning those. You can drag in your old materials. You could drag in the materials you were using when it was live, or you can set up or fetch new materials, whatever you want to do. So now that we have a regular mesh, all of Modo's normal material, part, so forth, editing tools will work. You'll be able to select by materials in the 3D viewport. All of this stuff will be available in the lists, including both parts and materials. Again, with the parts still only covering up to the strips, and the materials going all the way to the center of the strip. So you have access to both, as well as a separate access to the strips themselves. So that's about it for that one. Thanks.